right, you guys, happy Wednesday. We did it. What does this mean? So we already know, for my case specifically, in New Jersey, there is an admin code that prevents exit examinations from preventing nursing students from graduation, therefore verification to the Board of Nursing. We also know the National League of Nursing stance, that it doesn't support exit exams being used in this way. But what we didn't know at the time is ASIN has been working thoroughly to prevent this as a whole. When it comes to high-stakes testing, the ASIN Accreditation Commission for Education of Nursing considers any standardized or evaluation method, written, electronic, or demonstration used as a single determining factor for an important student outcome, such as passing a course, graduating from the program, or being approved to take a licensure or certification examination. So, what does this mean in real time? As of September 1st, 2026, the ASIN will no longer support exit exams being used in this manner. Not that they ever supported it, but now they are drawing a fine line that this will not be tolerated. This means all accredited nursing programs must follow their best practices. If a program does not follow the best practices and is using high-stakes testing, then the program will be non-compliant with this policy. And I know some of you guys are thinking, well, for-profit schools, for example, they can do what they want. They're privately owned. Not exactly. Nursing schools cannot override the State Board of Nursing or an accrediting body like ASIN. They are strictly bound by their regulations, and they must meet, exceed, or their minimum education and programmatic standards to maintain their legal operating status. This is great news to start off our video today. We are making progress, and we love to see it. Let's get into it. I think I'm completely justified, so let's take some common sense here. What's happening in the nursing education right now reads like a bad script from Hunger Games, if you ask me. Imagine buying a ticket to a Drake concert, but when you show up, the venue forces you to sit in an opera, right? Changes the security rules at the door without telling you, and then kicks you out without a refund because you didn't bring binoculars. That is exactly what it feels like to attend a school like Jersey College and experience what I have, and what they have done to other students. They drag you through years of grueling classes, it feels like. Pocket tens of thousands of dollars in tuition per student. And then, at the literal finish line, they pull out a high-stakes, unregulated, private corporate test that has absolutely nothing to do with what you actually were taught in the classroom, ? That's not education, if you ask me. In my observation, that's what some could see as a bait-and-switch cash cow, designed to protect a school's corporate stats, not train the frontline heroes of our healthcare system that desperately feels like you were set up for failure. That's how it literally feels to me. What I experienced at Jersey College of Nursing, I think, highlights a structural and educational inconsistency that frequently causes student grievances and petitions like mine. So I think they didn't follow best educational practices, and I think it adds to what the board, the NLN, and the ASIN are attempting to draw a hard line on. Welcome back to the Nursing Investigation. So Amy asks, was your exit exam HESI, ATI, or Kaplan? Or did the facility write the exam? This is where things get interesting. The contract I signed, the enrollment agreement that was presented on the day of orientation, didn't tell me. I didn't find out until later what a predictor probability exam was, what an exit exam actually was. When I was reading the contract, it made it seem like When I read the contract in present time, it seems like it could be seen as a comprehensive exam that you're given at the final of each course to surpass to the next term. To me, it didn't read that it was an exit exam that would keep me from graduation. It read more so like final exams. And if you know anything about contract law, to me, in my observation, I shouldn't have questions. It should be black and white. Moving forward, come to find out later in time, in the handbook, it specifies what exams they would be giving, what a minimum score was, etc. So it says I could be given any numerous of exams, including HESI, ATI, NLN, and from my experience, what I saw, what I witnessed, what I heard in the program is Jersey College did have their own exit exam. In my opinion, when you're presented with an enrollment agreement, your first contract, it should match the handbook. I shouldn't be given details later of what something actually means after I had already signed it. I also, especially to note when the effects could be so damaging, I also haven't found anywhere in the contract where these exit exams could keep my verification from the Board of Nursing. Also, in my experience, when I had signed that enrollment agreement, to me, it felt like a take it or leave it moment. After I had already made my investments, I was already there on orientation day and accepted to enter the program. And if you're a nursing student, you know exactly how extensive that process is. And I think, in my observation, this is the exact type of behavior the board, the NLN, and ASIN is working to put a hard stop to. But it gets worse. To prevent lawsuits and maintain accreditation, nursing schools usually follow strict statistical rules rather than a professor's personal choice, if you ask me. But it gets worse. Let me go over my experience in taking the exit exam. It felt like the chaos of exam roulette. The most glaring issue to me was that the school had forced me to take completely different exams. It could be HESI, ATI, NLN, or even, from my experience, what I have heard and seen at the school was their own made-up Jersey College exit exam was even possible. In the contract, it didn't specify which one you'd be given. It said, more or less, I'm paraphrasing in my own words, they had the right to give us any exam they want and call it an exit exam. Even without advance notice. I want you to keep in mind that these companies are competitors and they design their tests with fundamentally different formatting, scoring logic, and psychometric profiles. For example, HESI uses a highly complex and proprietary scoring algorithm. A score of 700 is a raw metric indicating the test was difficult. But the school demanded a 900, which is typically considered an excellent or advanced benchmark. So this is why I say the school only wanted those students with the highest probabilities to take the NCLEX. Not because the rest of us weren't prepared, not because our scores weren't good enough, but they wanted the highest probability. ATI, they use straight proficiency percentages. So my 62% was very close to their 68%. Doesn't mean I failed, just didn't meet the highest benchmark. The NLN. This evaluates core nursing logic using entirely distinct vocabulary frameworks. So my 72% was just a few questions shy of that 78% target, and ultimately throughout my nursing education is what it feels like. To me, I think this could be seen as arbitrary. Standardized tests measure test-taking endurance and platform familiarity, just as much as medical knowledge. But by shuffling the exams, the school essentially changed the rules of the game every time you walked into the room. Even if you knew all of your medical terminology and a good comprehension of nursing in general, I felt like it destroyed my ability to build a testing stamina or adjust to a single platform's layout. I also felt like there was a complete disconnect from the curriculum. Educational standards require that standardized benchmarking exams serve as curricular tools. Shouldn't be used as a surprise filter, if you ask me. If a school relies on like HESI or ATI, for example, to determine graduation, I think they're expected to map out their entire curriculum to that vendor's blueprint. To say, we're going to learn from NLN's textbook today, and then at the end, you're going to take an ATI practice exam to prepare you for any exam we give you, doesn't feel consistent to me. Lectures, quizzes, exams should mirror that platform's question style from day one. I've even seen schools have a 12-week program at the end to prepare their students for their exit exams. Giving us only a handful of ATI practice exams while dropping different tests like NLN, HESI, etc. at the finish line, I feel is a severe educational gap. We were forced to guess how to answer questions from vendors whose educational material we were never thoroughly taught. I feel like there was a lack of equal protection across the board. It was inconsistent per student, per classroom. The fact that I was permitted to retake the HESI, mind you, this was my weakest score, but essentially barred from retaking the NLN or the ATI, which I was the closest to passing to, only a few percentage points shy, is highly inconsistent. A fair academic policy applies the exact same opportunity for remediation across all testing variants. Limiting those retakes based on which randomized test booklet was drawn, I think creates an unequal playing field. Also, between these exams, there was no remediation. Why were students only offered remediation if they didn't meet the benchmark of them all? How are they supposed to meet the benchmark if they don't know what they got wrong? If they weren't allowed to see their scores? If they didn't know why this was happening? Where is the room for improvement? Did the school want us to improve? Those are questions I ask. And then we get into the surprise testing constraints and moving targets. The timer surprise. So come to find out, the standardized exit exams are strictly timed, requiring intense practice strategies. It could be in total, for example, you could have 4 hours to complete the entire process, or it could be timed per question. Walking into a high-stakes exit exam against all odds we already talked about, without even knowing it was timed, is a massive psychological and tactical disadvantage, if you ask me. Throwing out questions, for example. While standard vendors include unscored pilot questions, a school verbally telling students that questions will be thrown out post-exam without explicit, transparent parameters, signals, and unstable grading baseline. To avoid changing the exam's denominator, which can unfairly drop some students' percentages, most programs seek alternative fixes, accepting multiple keys, right? So accepting that B and C are correct instead of throwing out the entire question. Because what if most students got an answer wrong that I just happened to get right, and they throw that question out, and that was the question that would have made a difference in my score. And from my recollection, for one of the exams, it was told to me 30 questions would be thrown out. What if those questions were the ones that I got right that would have got me to that finish line? Or some schools add points to make it fair, giving every single student credit for that question, regardless of the original answer. So for example, if most or all students got a question wrong, they would just give them the points to make it fair across the board. Schools should be keeping decisions objective. So they want to try to avoid that arbitrary label. For example, low psychometric performance. Schools need to look at the discrimination index. If top performing students consistently get a question wrong, while failing students get it right, the question is statistically flawed. The item difficulty. If a question has a success rate below a certain threshold, it triggers automatic review, or it should. What about flawed questions? A question is only thrown out if a post-exit exam proves it had multiple correct answers, there's no correct answer, or there was an error within the question that changed the clinical meaning. But I feel like it crosses that arbitrary territory when a decision can be legally or academically challenged if the professor does not follow the official grading policy outlined in the course syllabus, which I have yet to find in the course syllabus how these exit exams were determined and graded. These things were only discussed verbally with me. They throw out a question simply because a few students complained without running a statistical analysis, which how can anybody complain if we were never allowed to see our scores, see the questions we got wrong, know exactly what was happening behind the scenes? Applies the policy inconsistently between different sections of the same course. And that brings me back to, well, what if I was just dealt a bad hand of really hard versions of the exams? What if the classroom next to me got an easier version? What if they were able to take ATI 4 times? Unlike me, where I got different exam after different exam. I also think there might be a financial conflict of interest. I question the contractual relationship between the school and these vendors. Nursing schools sign lucrative long-term exclusivity contracts with vendors like HESI or ATI. These contracts often include bundled packages where the school pays for learning modules or maybe some practice materials and a set number of test vouchers per student. Furthermore, schools rely heavily on these third-party benchmarks to protect their NCLEX pass rates, which directly impacts their state board approval and national accreditation. By implementing an exit exam block, it acts as a gatekeeper. It prevents students who might risk lowering the school's NCLEX average from graduating, keeping the tuition, money, free labor, hard work you've already done while effectively trapping your completed education behind an internal wall. This is where a lot of appeals and legal questions come into play. Because I think what I'm seeing here in my observation, there's a lack of standard institutional policies. That some may be seen as arbitrary or, I can never say this word, capricious enforcement, alongside an implicit admission of guilt by the school possibly. This is questions I ask myself, is it? Under educational law in general, from the information I can gather, a school cannot have a policy that bends for some students and breaks for others. There's a disparate treatment. Allowing certain students 5 attempts, Students have alleged before my graduating class, they were offered 5 attempts on the exit exam. What about the students who didn't get those 5 attempts? What about those students who are a few percentage points away that were allowed to pass on, affecting that minimum score benchmark? But not all of us were given that opportunity. I feel that's the definition of a disparate treatment. For example, the close enough standard. Students who are close enough proves that the school's strict benchmarks, for example, if the school wanted a 900 on the test on the HESI exam, but you got an 890, you're allowed to pass through if you got that score, and so on. If the passing score is legally and academically defensible, it must apply to everyone equally. Curving it to override it for a few select individuals, I think, proves that a school may be subjectively choosing who got to become a nurse. And then I get into questions about the policy change, an implicit admission of a flawed system from what I can see, from what I can gather. In my observation, when I think about Jersey College, subsequently dismantling the standalone exit exam policy, and now, from what students allege, it has been integrated into a student-structured course for later classes, is revealing. It's very interesting. So in my experience, I completed nursing school. Then when you're done, they say, okay, to graduate, essentially to get your verification sent to the Board of Nursing, you need to meet this benchmark of this exit exam, or it's not happening. From what students are telling me now, the exit exam has still been used after my graduating class, but it's been used within a course. So let's say you're taking fundamentals of nursing, hypothetically speaking, for example, in theory. If you pass fundamentals, but they include the exit exam at the end of that course, some say it's 30% of the grade or whatever it is, okay? And you don't meet a good enough benchmark, it could pull your score down so drastically that you end up failing the course. So they can't say the exit exam is keeping me from moving forward if you failed the class. To me, that looks like a loophole. So I think about it in the court of law. While a change in policy is technically considered a subsequent remedial measure, if I'm seeing it objectively, I think somebody in the legal world could look at it like a timeline to demonstrate that the school internally recognized its original testing structure was broken, unaligned, and educationally indefensible when we're talking about exit exams that have invalid results to begin with. Why did you change the policy? Why is it no longer required? Why is it in a course now? Why is it only worth 30% of a grade, for example? The inequity part of it, I look at it like, did they correct the curriculum for future students because they know the previous exam roulette, the Russian roulette, I feel like I experienced? Did they question if it was setting people up for failure? That's what it felt like to me. However, instead of offering remediation or grandfathering in, my cohort, for example, into that fairer system, it left us stranded with debt, no degree, and no verification to the Board of Nursing. I also sought research in due process and fair notice. What does that mean? Come to find out, every student has a constitutional right to due process when enrolled in a state-approved program like nursing. Due process requires fair notice. So, for example, if the rules of graduation change based on the mood of the administration or who was calling the shots that day. That student who walked in on a Monday faced with a completely different graduation standard than a student who walked in that Friday or who was in a different class or took it on a different day is questionable to me. From my research, I question the legality behind operating a high-stakes gatekeeper system where passing this threshold is unspoken. is unspoken, or a moving target dictated by possibly favoritism or an unwritten administrative discretion that's decided in the moment. To me, this is the reality. In my observation, it could be seen from my perspective and opinion. They could have been protecting class averages, not competency. Because remember, I can meet an exit exam benchmark and fail the NCLEX and not become a nurse because the exit exam doesn't prove competency. I can fail an exit exam, take my NCLEX and become a nurse because the NCLEX proves competency. So again, I'm like, okay, their first time NCLEX pass rate was looking good for the month. They might let a few close enough students slide through. Is that a possibility? If their institutional averages were dipping, would they tighten the vice and arbitrarily block students like myself to artificially inflate their passing metrics for the State Board of Nursing? This practice uses paying customers like myself as a statistical shield. In my opinion, in my observation, that is what I experienced. I felt like all in all, it was a moving goalpost, something I may have never been intended to meet. How can you accept a B or C student into your school that has a low 2.0 GPA average and expect them to act like an honor roll student or a valedictorian at the finish line? I don't think I failed to understand nursing concept. If you look at my scores, over months, they stayed pretty equal. They stayed pretty high. I think I was forced into an unmapped, randomized environment where I had to translate knowledge on my own into three or more entirely different testing languages under unknown time constraints without the institutional prep work I paid for. Mind you, from my recollection, I also had to pay for these exams out of pocket ongoing. I believe the first one was paid for. And this is where we get into my filing of my lawsuit. This is where the contract talk comes into play. When I enrolled in a nursing program, the student handbook, the syllabi, serves as legally binding contracts most of the time. Doesn't mean error cannot be found. Doesn't mean it will hold up at the end of the day. For example, the inconsistency of the policy. From my research, schools cannot legally create a moving target, allowing unlimited or dual retakes for one exam versus another without a written, documented rationale in the syllabus that proves disparate treatment among students. I also don't feel it was very fair to, on orientation day, I signed my own enrollment agreement as what I feel like was a take it or leave it moment after all the investments I had made up to that point. And if you've been in nursing school, you know what investments I'm talking about, how extensive it is, and do a general spiel about progression examinations that to me look like final exams per each course to progress to the next without going into detail about predictor exams, exit exams, how it would affect my license, what those scores were, etc. They would be timed, blah, 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 in that original contract, but then come to find out later what that all actually meant. I feel like the syllabus, the handbook, should match the contract to its entirety, especially when we're talking about something that could be so damaging. And in my experience, I don't see that it did. I haven't found that. Getting back to the National League of Nursing and the American Association of Colleges of Nursing have issued public positions statements strongly condemning the use of standardized exit exam scores to block graduation. Best educational practices dictate that a student's graduation must be determined by their cumulative course history, clinical evaluations, and overall GPA. The violation, I question? Did Jersey College treat these third-party exams as a single absolute gatekeeper? I wonder if an expert witness, like a legal nurse consultant, would point out that using an exit exam in this way, especially when you passed all of your actual classes, the accredited portion of the program, what financial aid and those grants covered, is educationally invalid and punitive rather than a diagnostic remedy. And then I go on to thinking a little more. What does it look like when we're mixing incompatible standard frameworks? Because I don't think you can accurately measure human knowledge by constantly changing the scale of the measurement. HESI scores one way on a proprietary algorithm. ATI uses a reference proficiency level, straight percentage scores. By forcing us to bounce between these platforms, also, we did use UWorld, and what do you think UWorld told me? That I was going to pass my NCLEX. Why weren't we using that as the measure? Anyways, by forcing us to bounce between these platforms, the school, it looks like to me, in my observation, engaged in possibly psychometric malpractice. I question, is that even a thing? What does that mean? It's the educational equivalent of telling a runner they must qualify for a race by running 100 meters, then a 5K, then a hurdle race, without telling them which track they are stepping onto until they arrive. The surprise timing behind it all. Constraints about pacing strategies and how long we'd be able to take these tests. If it was timed per question. Throwing out questions. Not providing that transparency. Brings us to the questions of gatekeeping and best consumer practices or not. The financial connection, I think, could be argued, could be the most damaging point. Protecting the matrix. The State Board of Nursing penalized or shut down nursing schools whose first-time pass rates drop below a certain percentage. So what could be the motive, I ask? Do schools have a historical consumer complaints about this type of practice regarding their testing and exit exam methods? Do schools do this if they let you graduate and fail the NCLEX, if their institutional score drops, risking their accreditation without even telling you? Can they do that? Should schools let you know if they're at risk of losing accreditation, if they're on probation? Because why else would they use these exit exams? But if they block you from graduating via internal said exit exams, you don't count against that NCLEX average. And if they don't tell you what's happening, how can you even prepare? How will you even know what's coming next to fight it? while pocketing tens of thousands of dollars per student in tuition, avoiding regulatory penalties, and leave you with debt and no degree, no verification to the board. Leaving you in a position, like students most like myself, of low income, lack of resources, of minorities. Some, English isn't even their first language, to find attorneys who specialize in such a niche problem. You're stacked against the odds. Not to mention fighting an institutional chain of a nursing school that's much bigger than you. It's disproportionate. I feel like if one would take this data to the right person, we're not saying the test was hard. It feels like the program utilized unmapped, unaligned curricular benchmarks that were inconsistent across randomized testing platforms, and maybe even failed to give us due notice. Testing constraints, resulting in arbitrary and capricious barrier to graduation, ? These are questions I ask. And then we get to the last piece of the puzzle, the legal distinction. State regulated versus corporate owned. The NCLEX is a legally regulated exam governed by the National Council of the State Boards of Nursing, the NCSBN. It exists for one reason: public safety. State oversight. They have the power to issue license. The NCLEX is carefully monitored by government bodies to ensure it is legally defensible, culturally unbiased, and psychometrically fair. There's no regulation for exit exams. They are corporate owned. They are contracted. They have one goal in mind that the NCLEX doesn't. ATI, HESI, NLN, Kaplan, there's so many. They're completely unregulated. They're private commercial products. There is no state law or federal agency that regulates how a private company writes an exit exam, how hard those questions are, if it's aligned with the coursework, or what a passing score should be. It is not accredited to any measure to determine competency to be a nurse. So I think the argument comes in by using these commercial products as a graduation barrier, preventing licensure because it prevents you from sitting for your NCLEX, prevents you from getting your ATT entirely. Do nursing schools outsource its academic authority to an unregulated third-party corporation that has no accreditation? I was denied a degree not based on state standards, not based on nursing standards, but based on a private company's arbitrary, profit-driven metrics. I think one proves competency and one, some say, proves probability. The NCLEX measures minimum competency. The NCLEX uses computer adaptive testing to determine if you possess the minimum safe knowledge to practice as an entry-level nurse. It's designed, if you pass, you meet those minimum safety requirements. Exit exams measure probability. It's a risk assessment, not as far as safety, but they measure predictive probability on whether you will pass your NCLEX on the first try. Those are two very different things. I think it could be questioned as an arbitrary nature, because the school didn't stop me from graduating because I was unsafe, regardless of what they're saying now. I feel like I was stopped from graduating because what I observed was a represented 5% to a 10% risk to their institutional NCLEX statistics. I feel like they used an unregulated prediction tool to gatekeep my livelihood solely based on a corporate passing rate. That is what it looks like to me. That is my opinion. That is what I'm seeing from my research, what I can gather and understand. That is what it looks like to me. Because the NCLEX is highly regulated, candidates are given a strict due process, okay? There is no universal retake There is no universal retake policy. On the regulated NCLEX, if you fail, the law guarantees you the right to try again after 45 days, multiple times. At my school, my right to retake the exam was entirely at the whim of administration, changing depending on which tests they wanted to draw for me. I call this the black box scoring. If you fail an exit exam, the commercial vendors do not let you see the questions you missed, and my school didn't let me see my scores for all of them. I cannot learn my mistakes and verify if the grading was accurate, which violates standard educational practices regarding transparent remediation. That's why I never received it. They weren't doing it for me. The shifting pass lanes. State boards cannot randomly raise the passing standards of the NCLEX overnight. However, private schools using unregulated exams can change their required HESI score, for example, from one semester to the next without regulatory approval, or even change the test entirely. So all in all, I feel like I was put in a situation where I was against all odds. I was totally invested just to, at the finish line, deal with an exit exam roulette. A curricular disconnect, failing to align day-to-day teachings with surprise benchmarks at the end for models I wasn't prepared for. Discriminatory retakes, arbitrarily capping retakes on certain versions except others, allowing me to retake the test I did the worst on but not the best on. And the unregulated gatekeeping. To me, it feels like weaponizing private commercial prediction software to prevent statistics rather than using the regulated competency standard the NCLEX is there for. On top of those surprise conditions, hidden timers, the lack of transparency, the grading adjustments, thrown out questions. Was I set up for failure? Were we set up for failure? At the end of the day, it's giving rules of thee, but not for me. The system is completely rigged from my observation. That is what it looks like to me. These schools are out here playing survivor with your career, randomly changing the rules, letting some students take the exam 5 times while cutting others off at 1 or 4, by changing the benchmark for certain students, letting certain students who are close enough go on. Then quietly getting rid of the whole broken test policy for the next graduating class once they realize this may not be working. This may not end in our favor. Those are questions I ask. It feels like I'm being gaslit. I feel like somebody wants me to believe that I wasn't competent. But the truth is, did they weaponize unregulated corporate prediction software to shield their own institutional passing rates from state regulators? I think it defies basic logic when you put it like that. It defies fair play. And honestly, to me, defies common sense. It's time we call this exactly what it is. Is it a multi-million-dollar gatekeeping? You said it, not me. Is this a behavior that uses paying students as statistical shields? And it's time we shut the game down. All right, questions and comments for this week. Lupin and Daffodil says that college better pay your student loans because this is BS. We have too many nurses out and about to prevent good nurses from getting their diplomas. Honestly, if the NCLEX can't even prove 100% at the end of the day who's going to be the best nurse and the people we need in healthcare, how can an exit exam? Because students take their NCLEX, they go on to be practicing nurses, and you see them in the news for hurting their own children, for hurting babies. So many things happen. Paul McDonald says, maybe go to law school and fight for nurses instead. Pivot. Jamie says, defamation is only applicable if you lied. You didn't. I can't wait for it to be Price Nursing School. They messed with the wrong woman. That would be great. Do I take this the legal route? Do I become a legal nurse consultant? Do I open a school and do things right? Do I help all these students who are put in situations like me? Do I take this to politics? Stormy says it's not defamation if it's true. I wonder what the school is hiding. The legal NP says keep standing your ground. And I said, because a nurse told me to, yes, I will. Ashley Sampson says, you're making changes, Clarissa. Your testimony, I pray, will not only take you into your diploma and license, but also set such a precedent for future students. God forbid this happens. I love you always. Thank you, Ashley. Paul Williams says, I went to Jersey College. I'm not shocked. I dropped and switched my schools. I had to start over because of it. Deborah says, you have my support. User 1001241336845 says, girl, simply amazing. Changing the course of nursing for everyone. All right, guys. I will see you next week. Thank you for joining me for another episode, and I can't wait to see what we get into next week. Bye, guys.